Hi, we are Laura Villarreal and Magdalena Romera. This is part of a research in progress supported by the Ministerio de Ciencia y Education in Spain.
This is how the presentation is divided. First, the introduction, where we will talk about the language diversity in Colombia, the Nasa-yuwe language, and the Nasa culture. Second, there is the methodology of the study, especially the problem we identified and the methods we used to address that problem. In third place, we will show the results we have gathered so far from the extracts of the interviews. This is subdivided into social factors and language attitudes and ideologies. Finally, we will talk about some final remarks based on the discussion of key theoretical issues and our findings. Let's start with the Colombian context, specifically the languages in Colombia and their vitality nowadays. This is based on Miernik and King, 2021. Colombia is a multilingual country whose official language is Spanish, but it has approximately 65 indigenous languages, with a great variety of phonetic, phonological, morphosyntactic, and semantic structures that have allowed them to be classified into 13 linguistic families. Colombia is one of the Latin American countries that has the largest number of indigenous languages in force. Iriby Jongbloed and Anderson, 2014, state that around 68 languages survive in Colombia, spoken by some 850,000 indigenous people. In Colombia, we also have Creole languages of San Basilio de Palenque and Romani. The study reveals that speakers of native languages do not reach 5% of the population. This ethnic linguistic loss is associated with different factors, as you can see listed in the slide. Most of them are related to difficulties in generational transmission. As the authors expose, the presence of indigenous and Afro-Colombian people living in communities marginalized by the government and fought over by non-state actors for their geopolitical and economic benefit have likely exacerbated an already fraught situation of language endangerment. Poverty and lack of economic opportunity in these marginalized communities further undermines the sustainability of the diminishing numbers of language speakers. Also, the education provided to the communities is done mostly in Spanish, and the lack of bilingual personnel prepared to teach early childhood has broken to strengthen the mother tongue of each indigenous group. Now let's move to the Nasa community and their language. The Nasa-yuwe. The Nasa indigenous people are located in the southwestern region of Colombia, specifically in the foothills of the Central Mountain Range. Regarding the ethnographic data, they live in geographical spaces called cabildos, indigenous reservations, which have independent governments but share the same cultural and organizational ideology. There are social causes that have forced the Nasa to leave their lands to create new settlements in various areas of the country, especially in the big cities. Let's talk about the language. It is considered to be a language isolate, and it is one of the most spoken languages in Colombia. Almost 60,000 native speakers. This is the second part of our presentation. The methodology.
As we previously exposed and supported with the study of Miernik and King, there are numerous instances of rebel groups and states seeking to destroy ethno-linguistic groups as a means of ethnic cleansing and establishing hegemony, forcing indigenous groups to move all around the country, especially to urban areas, as Bogotá, the capital of Colombia.
As we said before, forced displacement has caused the intensification of violence in rural areas of the country. Displaced indigenous people are heading to the large urban centers of Colombia and neighboring countries. They prefer to migrate to Bogotá because it is a remote area where indigenous can enjoy some level of natural protection against colonizers intent on exploiting their territories. They also see in the city the opportunity to have access to better opportunities, as a better job, a high quality of education, and a better lifestyle. As the researchers pointed out, Colombia's periods of violent upheaval had the harshest impact on indigenous people who were already facing language loss and located near conflict zones. For decades, the Colombian government waged a difficult and frequently bloody war against the rebels of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, the National Liberation Army, ELN, the Popular Liberation Army, EPL, and the M19 movement, often with the assistance of paramilitary allies. The ging for political control, as well as violence associated with narco-trafficking, created one of the worst cases of internally displaced persons in the world. They also see in the city the opportunity to have access to better opportunities, as a better job, a high quality of education, and a better lifestyle. So, in the present research work, we focus on the Nasa community located in Bogotá. The following data was gathered from a 2-year immersion program at the Nasa Cabildo in Bogotá. We utilized 1. The participant observation (PO) method, which allowed us to collaborate with the Cabildo authorities and residents. We also conducted 2. Semi-structured interviews with the Nasa people who have lived in Bogotá. As this is a research in progress, we are still gathering information, so we will be feeding the results as we are collecting data from the participants and our field notes. Now, please look at the following table in which we expose the profiles of our participants. Based on the ethnographic data we collected from the Cabildo in Bogotá, we carefully chose the most salient characteristics from our participants. There are 3 main age groups, from 18 to 35, from 36 up to 60, and the last one, the people who are more than 60 years old. We considered another variable as the educational level, low, medium, and high, which, as you can see, vary depending on the range of age. Finally, we take into account the gender in all of the age groups, 2 women and 2 men in all of the cases. We finally selected 24 speakers. All right. Now we are going to describe how is the Nasa community living in Bogotá. This is a very small community that maintains Nasa's culture, traditions, and beliefs. They don't have a limited area of living. They are all around the city, depending on their particular interests. They have a meeting point, which is basically a political space where they discuss socio-political issues. They have their own government, even though they have to follow the rules of Bogotá's government. Nasa-yuwe language is currently in risk of loss, as Spanish is the main language used in the city. Based on the previous information, we decided to create a semi-structured interview divided into 10 parts, as you can read in the slide. Here you have some examples from the interviews. Of course, the realization of those varied depending on the participant. So we had to add more questions if the conversation required it, or we eliminated some others if the speaker refused to give information. Interviews are done in Spanish, as this is the language of the researchers. The participants answered them in Spanish too, allowing themselves to elicit some words in Nasa-yuwe.
In this part, we will talk about the results based on 2 important aspects. Social factors that interfere with the Nasa's language identities. Linguistic attitudes around their language use in Bogotá. We will support our results based on the answers we have gathered so far. Some of the extracts will be presented with some of the important data from our participants. Next, we want to present a short video recorded by ourselves in which we exemplify a reunion of Nasa-yuwe speakers in Bogotá.
My displacement started in 2000. In 2001 I arrived in Bogotá due to the violence. As I was an important leader in my territory, I was labeled as belonging to an armed group. Then they, the guerrilla, killed my family and threatened me, so I had to abandon my home.
The first social issue we identified is the current social situation that is forcing Nazas to speak Spanish. As you can see, speakers argued that they moved to the city, not because of internal convictions, but they have done it because they were forced to do so. Their families were killed and they were obligated to run away. This is because most of the habitants in the Cabildo in Bogotá were important leaders in their ancestral territories, so they represented a threat to the armed groups residing in the Cauca.
We are displaced by violence. At that time, my wife was an authority in my territory. They threatened her, if we didn't leave, it was either our lives or settling in Bogotá.
The second issue comes from the previous one. Most of the habitants in the Cabildo are leaders who are searching for a better life for Nazas in Colombia. Nazas are politically active, and their main worry is to defend their territory and culture, so, they moved to Bogotá with the intention of prepare themselves to have better academic perspectives, to have more direct access to governmental institutions located in Bogotá, and finally, to make their voice heard through the media usage.
Due to a lack of economic resources, we have to go to the city, looking for better opportunities to work and study. We no longer teach Nasa-yuwe to children in the city, and this happens because, even though Nasa, from the spiritual point of view, is a mathematician, anthropologist, sociologist, psychologist, and astronomer, we are always trying to look for that Western orientation, and when it occurs, the universities change our perspectives.
This third aspect is again connected to the previous ones. As in their territories, they don't usually have access to universities, so they decide to travel to Bogotá, where there are plenty of academic spaces. As it is exposed in the slide, their ridership fosters them to look for academic guides that can support and complement their social struggles and goals. Sadly, they aimed at such a Western vision forced them to change their ancestral thoughts, including the use of the Spanish language. Also, they move intending to find a better job that helps them to solve their basic needs. We divided this section into three main results. First, ethnic identity and contact with Spanish language in the city. Second, the status of the languages, Nasa-yuwe and Spanish and their beliefs toward them. And finally the intergeneric transmission and how it is interfering the language's preferences and attitudes of the speakers in Bogotá.
People, especially children and young people who come from an indigenous territory to the cities, experience this discrimination in the city. They call them, "See, this is a native." Contemptuous voice. There are cons to the word indigenous, but in general, I define myself as indigenous because I come from a territory, my parents are indigenous, and where I live is also an indigenous territory. I do call myself indigenous. There are situations where the word indigenous is taken.
Regarding ethnic identities, we identified that all of the participants so far have argued that their Nasa identity is the most important aspect for them. They said that in Bogotá they are discriminated against by the locals. They also expressed that citizens in Bogotá use discriminatory words to label indigenous people. This is a key point in this research, because we hypothesize that the closest indigenous speakers are to their culture, the biggest is the use of their language.
We indigenous people must adapt to the city without ignoring what we are. There are Nasa indigenous people who are happy speaking Nasa, but there are others who say, "I don't need to speak it, therefore I don't consider myself Nasa, I prefer to be part of the city. But I consider myself a good Nasa, likewise, I consider myself a good citizen, and even though I am in Bogotá, my identity is that of an original Nasa."
Participants also said that living in the city has forced them to adapt to the new culture of the city. They don't want to be discriminated against, neither judged or excluded from the labor market. They also admitted that, as they are now part of the city, they must follow the rules existing in the new place. A second point relates to the status of the languages and the speakers' beliefs towards them. So far, all the participants have said that Nasa-yuwe is the most important language because their mother tongue is the central point of their identities. Consequently, they have to use Spanish because it is the language used in all Bogotá. As it is presented in the examples, they also express the Bogotanian citizens consider Spanish as the most prestigious language, being the Nasa-yuwe language, a minority language that could sound strange and different.
I try to speak in Nasa-yuwe almost every day with my daughter because we have a challenge and a goal, to revive the language again. For me, it is essential because it is the language that gives us that strength, that cultural identity, and we cannot let that language and many languages that are here be lost in Colombia, which gives us wealth as Colombians.
Finally, the previous factors have induced an interference during the intergeneric transmission of the Nasa-yuwe language. Some speakers argued that they don't teach their ancestral language to their children anymore because they don't want their kids to be punished, killed, or bullied. Otherwise, despite those negative realities, some speakers strengthen the use of their native language at home, because they are aware of the importance this has to their cultures. I speak Nasa with my son every day, with my sisters all the time in Nasa-yuwe. Yes, it is very important to preserve because speaking Nasa-yuwe, those who do not speak say that it is not easy, so it is very important so that it is not forgotten. To conclude, we have connected the two main issues addressed before, the social factors and the language identities of the Nasa-yuwe speakers. As it is evidenced, the social realities around the Nasa community have shaped their preferences during language use and their beliefs. The most positive aspect we want to highlight is that, despite all of the challenges Nasa community is facing nowadays, they are still fighting against language loss and social discrimination. Thank you so much for your interest in our presentation. We want to thank the Nasa Cabildo in Bogotá, the authorities, and all of the members who have welcomed us in such a friendly way. The following slide contains the references we used for this presentation. We hope you have enjoyed it.